During a special dinner, a millionaire arrives at an elegant restaurant where his girlfriend was already waiting for him. They sit together and, shortly after, the woman gets up to go to the bathroom. Moments later, the millionaire is startled to see a little beggar girl running towards his table. Out of breath, she whispers, "Sir, don't eat that cake. She put something inside it." Before the girlfriend returns, he decides to switch the cake plates. 2 hours later, the millionaire is completely shocked by what happens. The autumn sun painted the New York City streets golden as Edward Miller adjusted the cuff of his Italian shirt and checked his watch for the third time. At 42, he bore the weight of a fortune built with grit and intelligence, but also the lightness of someone who had always known how to use his wealth for good. That special afternoon, every detail needed to be perfect. The Gilded Lily restaurant emerged before him like an oasis of elegance in the heart of the city. Outdoor tables adorned with white rose arrangements contrasted with the constant movement of the avenue. The aroma of fine spices mingled with the scent of flowers, creating an atmosphere that promised an unforgettable evening. Edward took a deep breath, feeling nervousness mixed with anticipation. He was walking towards the entrance when a timid little voice made him stop. At his feet, a girl no more than 6 years old held out a small, dirty hand. Her large, dark eyes shone with a mix of hope and resignation that would touch any sensitive heart. Her torn, stained clothes told a story of neglect that Edward knew well. "Please, mister," she murmured, avoiding direct eye contact. It wasn't. The first time they had met, Edward remembered those eyes perfectly, the same pleading expression that had touched him on other occasions. Without hesitation, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, placing them in the child's small hands with the delicacy of someone handling something precious. "Thank you," she whispered, and for the first time, her eyes met his. In that instant, Edward saw something that deeply unsettled him, a precocious wisdom, as if that child carried secrets too heavy for her age. The smile she offered him was pure and genuine, brutally contrasting with the cruel reality surrounding her. Edward felt a pang in his chest, an inexplicable desire to do more, to change her situation. But the hands of the clock reminded him of the engagement awaiting him. Inside the restaurant, Isabella was already waiting. At 35, she was the epitome of sophisticated elegance. Perfectly styled blonde hair framed a face that seemed sculpted by an artist. The navy blue dress accentuated every curve of her slender body, and the smile she gave him as he arrived made his heart race. "You're late," she teased, gently kissing his cheek. "I thought you'd given up on surprising me." Edward gallantly pulled out her chair, admiring how the golden afternoon light created reflections in her hair. "I would never give up on a moment." "Like this," he replied, feeling the nervousness rise again. "Tonight is special, Isabella." The restaurant buzzed with the typical energy of a busy late afternoon. Impeccably dressed waiters moved among the tables with the precision of a rehearsed choreography. The discreet sound of lively conversations mixed with the clinking of glasses and silverware, creating a comforting urban symphony. Isabella observed, everything with eyes bright with anticipation. Her fingers drummed nervously on the marble tabletop, and Edward sensed that she too felt something special was about to happen. The connection between them had always been intense, built over 2 years of a relationship that seemed perfect in every aspect. "You seem different today," she observed, leaning slightly forward. "There's something in your eyes, a determination I haven't seen in a long time." Edward smiled, but his mind kept returning to the image of the girl on the street. There was something about that encounter that bothered him, a strange feeling he couldn't define. Perhaps it was just the nervousness of the special night he had planned, or perhaps it was something deeper, an intuition his rational mind couldn't yet process. The waiter approached with professional discretion, carrying a silver tray that reflected the ambient lights. The night was just beginning, but Edward already felt that nothing would be the same after this date. Unaware of how right he was, he prepared to live one of the most decisive nights of his life. The Dom Pérignon champagne bubbled in the crystal glasses as Edward watched Isabella's radiant face. The table was decorated with rose petals and scented candles that created an intimate atmosphere even amidst the restaurant's buzz. Every detail had been carefully planned to make that night unforgettable. "To us," Edward toasted, raising his glass, "to everything we've built together and to everything that's yet to come." Isabella smiled enigmatically, her green eyes shining with an intensity he couldn't quite decipher. "To us," she repeated, her glass touching his with a crystalline sound that echoed above them like a promise. The first course arrived with impeccable presentation, a salmon carpaccio with capers and truffle oil that awakened the senses with its aroma alone. Edward watched Isabella's every gesture, how she delicately cut small pieces and brought them to her rosy lips. There was a natural grace in her, movements that had always fascinated him. "Do you remember our first date?" he asked, trying to push away the strange feeling that had accompanied him since meeting the girl on the street. Isabella laughed, a melodious sound that drew admiring glances from neighboring tables. "How could I forget? You spilled coffee on my favorite white blouse in the hotel lobby." Her fingers played with the diamond ring adorning her right hand. "I thought you were just another clumsy businessman trying to impress me." "And you weren't wrong," Edward admitted, relaxing for the first time that night. "I was so nervous seeing you that I completely lost my coordination." The conversation flowed naturally between them, punctuated by the dishes that arrived one after another. Porcini mushroom risotto, lamb medallions with a red wine reduction, side dishes that looked like small works of art. Isabella commented on each flavor with a sommelier's knowledge, demonstrating the sophistication that had always characterized her personality. During the meal, Edward noticed how well Isabella knew the waiters. She greeted some by name, made specific requests with the familiarity of a regular. A pang of curiosity bothered him. He didn't know she came to the Gilded Lily so often. "Do you come here frequently?" he asked casually, watching a waiter approach with special attention to serve Isabella. "Sometimes," she replied, slightly averting her gaze. "It's a special place, perfect for occasions like this." Her hand found his on the table, their fingers intertwining gently. "You chose very well, Edward." The maitre d' approached the table with almost theatrical reverence, carrying a small box wrapped in gold paper. "Compliments of the house," he announced, placing the gift before Isabella. "To celebrate this special night." Edward frowned, surprised. He hadn't mentioned the special nature of the night to anyone. How did the restaurant know? Isabella seemed equally surprised, but her eyes sparkled with pleasure as she delicately undid the ribbon. Inside the box, a white gold bracelet with blue sapphires captured the candlelight. It was a stunning piece, obviously expensive, and Edward wondered what kind of relationship Isabella had with the restaurant management to deserve such a courtesy. "It's beautiful," she murmured, allowing Edward to place the jewelry on her wrist. "But you didn't have to." "I didn't," Edward began to say, but was interrupted by the waiter's arrival with dessert. The Belgian chocolate cake came with red berries and a small card that read, "For the perfect night." Edward watched Isabella admire the presentation, but a strange feeling grew in his chest. Small details began to add up, creating a picture he couldn't fully comprehend. The image of the beggar girl returned to his mind, unbidden. Those large, wise eyes, the expression of someone carrying heavy secrets. There was something about that encounter that continued to bother him, an urgency in her voice that now seemed to echo in his memory with greater clarity. Isabella rose gracefully, interrupting his thoughts. "I'm going to the powder room to freshen up," she announced, gently kissing his forehead. "Don't start dessert without me." Edward watched her walk away, admiring how she moved with elegance, even in high heels. Other customers also watched her, and he felt a pang of pride, mixed with something more complex he couldn't identify. Alone at the table, his eyes turned to the untouched cake, and an inexplicable sense of apprehension gripped his heart. The silence that settled at the table after Isabella left was filled by the ambient sounds of the restaurant. Edward drummed, his fingers nervously on the marble tabletop, his eyes wandering around the elegant setting without really seeing anything. The sense of unease that had accompanied him throughout the evening seemed to intensify with each passing minute. The chocolate cake remained untouched before him, its perfect layers adorned with fresh strawberries and a delicate sugar decoration. The presentation was flawless, like everything in that restaurant, but something about that dessert bothered him inexplicably. Perhaps it was just the nervousness of the special occasion, or perhaps it was something deeper that his intuition was trying to communicate. Edward observed the other customers around. Elegant couples conversed in low tones, executives discussed business over glasses of red wine, and wealthy families celebrated special occasions with the naturalness of those accustomed to luxury. Everything seemed absolutely normal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement between the tables. The beggar girl he had met at the entrance was running towards his table, dodging waiters and customers with desperate agility. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she panted as if she had run a long distance. Edward straightened in his chair, surprised by the unexpected appearance. How had she managed to get into the restaurant? Security was strict in that establishment, especially with homeless children. Before he could form any questions, she reached his chair and leaned down, whispering with desperate urgency, "Mister, don't eat that cake." The words tumbled out, laden with an anguish that chilled Edward's blood. She put something in it. The world seemed to stop for an instant. Edward looked at the girl, then at the cake, then back at those large eyes shining with desperate tears. Her voice was low but clear, each word spoken with a conviction that couldn't be ignored. "What did you say?" Edward leaned closer, his voice also reduced to a whisper. "How do you know that?" But the girl was already backing away, her nervous eyes scanning the room as if searching for some invisible threat. "I saw her," she murmured quickly. "In the kitchen. She knows people here." Her small hands trembled visibly. "She can't know I told you." Before Edward could ask more questions, the girl turned and ran again between the tables, disappearing as quickly as she had appeared. He tried to get up to follow her, but she had already vanished into the crowd of customers and staff, as if she had never been there. Edward remained motionless, his heart pounding as he processed what had just happened. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the napkin to wipe the cold sweat that had broken out on his forehead. Could that child be telling the truth, or was it just the imagination of a young mind traumatized by life on the streets? He looked again at the cake, which now seemed menacing under the golden candlelight. Every detail of the decoration, which had previously seemed perfect, now aroused suspicion. The frosting too smooth, the consistency slightly different in certain parts. Or was it just his imagination running wild? The sound of approaching high heels made him look up. Isabella was returning from the powder room, even more radiant than before. She had retouched her makeup and lipstick, and her hair seemed to have been combed again. The smile she gave him was warm and expectant. "Miss me?" she teased, gracefully sitting back down. Her eyes went immediately to the untouched cake. "Good thing you waited for me. This dessert is the house specialty." Edward forced a smile, but his mind was working frantically. If the girl's warning was true, he needed to act quickly, but without arousing suspicion. How could he test the truth of that absurd accusation without sounding completely paranoid? "You know this place well, don't you?" he asked casually, carefully observing Isabella's reaction. "Why do you ask?" she replied, but Edward noticed a slight stiffening in her posture. "It's a famous restaurant. Many people know it." Edward's discomfort grew. There was definitely something strange about Isabella's evasive answer. His hands moved instinctively towards the cake, and a desperate decision formed in his mind. If there was any possibility of danger, he couldn't ignore the girl's warning. "How about one more toast before dessert?" he suggested, buying time as he formulated a plan. Edward raised his champagne glass with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, forcing a smile he hoped looked natural. Isabella watched him curiously, her green eyes studying every nuance of his expression. The air between them seemed charged with a tension only he could feel. "To our story," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "and to all the special moments we'll still share." Isabella smiled and raised her glass, but Edward noticed a subtle impatience in her gestures. Her eyes constantly turned to the untouched cake, as if that dessert were the true goal of the evening. The observation sent a shiver down his spine. "Edward, are you okay?" she asked, leaning slightly forward. "You seem different since I got back." "I'm perfect," he lied, taking a sip of champagne to buy time. His mind worked feverishly, trying to find a way to confirm or dismiss the suspicions growing in his heart. "Just thinking about how lucky I am to have you by my side." Isabella's smile widened, but Edward noticed it didn't reach her eyes. There was something calculated in her expression, a coldness he had never noticed before. Or perhaps it had always been there and he had simply chosen not to see. "How about we start dessert?" she suggested, picking up the silver cake knife. "I'm eager to try it. They say it's an exclusive recipe from the chef." Edward watched her hands move, noting how she handled the knife with familiarity. Every gesture seemed carefully rehearsed, as if she already knew exactly how to proceed. The suspicion growing in his chest transformed into an icy certainty. "Wait," he said, placing his hand over hers. "How about I serve? After all, tonight is special for both of us." Isabella hesitated for a fraction of a second, then released the knife with a forced laugh. "What a gentleman," she murmured. But Edward detected irritation in her voice. "You've always been so thoughtful." Edward picked up the knife, but instead of cutting the cake, he pretended something had fallen to the floor. "I dropped my napkin," he said, discreetly bending down. During the seconds he was out of Isabella's sight, his hands worked quickly, swapping the plates with precise movements born of desperation. When he straightened up again, Edward forced a calm smile. "There we go," he said, cutting the cake and serving 2 generous slices. "For you, my love." Isabella picked up her fork, but Edward noticed she was carefully watching which slice was in front of her. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, as if trying to identify something specific. His heart was beating so loudly, he was sure she could hear it. "Aren't you going to eat?" she asked, noticing he was just staring at his slice without touching it. "Of course I am," Edward replied, picking up his fork. "I'm just admiring the presentation. It's truly a work of art." For the next few minutes, they ate in relative silence, punctuated only by superficial comments about the taste and texture. Edward forced each bite, his stomach churning with tension and the terrible possibility that his paranoia was justified. Isabella ate with apparent pleasure, but he noticed she watched him constantly, as if expecting a specific reaction. "It's delicious," she commented, finishing her slice. "You should eat more. You've barely touched yours." Edward agreed and pretended to eat a few more bites, but his mind was focused on observing any change in Isabella's behavior. If the girl's warning was true, how long would it take for the effects to manifest? The restaurant continued to bustle around them, oblivious to the silent drama unfolding at their table. Couples chatted animatedly, waiters circulated with professional efficiency, and the city's nightlife pulsed through the windows. For all intents and purposes, Edward and Isabella looked like just another couple celebrating a special occasion. But beneath the elegant surface, a current of suspicion and fear ran through every look, every word, every gesture. Edward felt as if he were walking a tightrope over an abyss, trying to maintain balance between growing distrust and the need to appear normal. "Want to order another bottle of champagne?" Isabella asked, signaling the waiter. "The night is still young." Edward agreed, but his eyes were fixed on her face, searching for any sign of change. If his desperate decision to swap the plates was correct, he would soon know the truth. And if he was wrong, he would have committed an act of distrust that could forever destroy the relationship he believed to be perfect. Time seemed to crawl as Edward watched Isabella's every move with increasing intensity. She continued to chat normally, commenting on the ambiance, praising the decor, asking about weekend plans. Her voice maintained the same melodious tone as always, but Edward felt as if he were listening to a stranger through a veil of suspicion. 30 minutes had passed since she finished her slice of cake. Edward mentally timed every second, his eyes trained to catch any subtle change in her expression or behavior. Several times, he questioned whether he was losing his mind, whether the word of a street child really justified such paranoia. "You're very quiet tonight," Isabella observed, seductively playing with her hair. "I thought you were excited about our celebration." "I'm just soaking in the moment," Edward replied, forcing a smile. "Sometimes it's good to just observe and appreciate." Isabella laughed, but the sound seemed forced to his ears. She picked up her Italian leather handbag and began to rummage through its contents, pulling out a lipstick to touch up her lips. Edward noticed her hands were trembling slightly, a detail that might have gone unnoticed by any casual observer. "Is everything all right?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "You seem a little agitated." "Of course, I'm fine," she replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "It's just the excitement of the night. You know how sensitive I am to special moments." Edward nodded, but continued to watch. Isabella put away her lipstick and picked up her cell phone, checking messages with increasingly nervous movements. Her eyebrows furrowed slightly as she typed a quick reply, and Edward noticed she discreetly glanced towards the restaurant's kitchen. The waiter approached their table with professional courtesy, refilling their water and asking if they needed anything else. Edward noticed he exchanged a significant look with Isabella, eye contact that lasted only a fraction of a second, but was enough to catch his attention. "A little more time here will be sufficient," Isabella told the waiter, her voice carrying an authority Edward had never noticed before. "There's no rush." When the waiter walked away, Edward leaned forward. "How do you know the staff here so well? That waiter seemed familiar." Isabella laughed again, but this time the sound came out slightly shrill. "Edward, you're imagining things. It's a popular restaurant. I've been here a few times with friends. It's natural that some employees recognize me." But her explanations didn't convince Edward. Small details began to add up. The excessive familiarity with the place, the unsolicited gifts, the insistence on the specific cake, the exchanged glances with the staff. Each piece of the puzzle created an increasingly disturbing picture. 45 minutes after dessert, Edward noticed the first real change in Isabella's behavior. She brought her hand to her forehead, massaging her temples with circular movements. Her eyelids seemed heavier, and she blinked more frequently than usual. "Are you feeling okay?" Edward asked, a mixture of genuine concern and confirmation of his worst fears warring in his chest. "Just a slight headache," she murmured, but Edward noticed her voice was slightly slurred. "It must be the champagne. You know, I don't have much tolerance for alcohol." Edward knew this was a lie. Isabella had always had excellent tolerance for alcoholic beverages, often impressing him with her ability to maintain composure even after several glasses of wine. The excuse was obviously fabricated to explain symptoms she hadn't expected to feel. "How about we leave?" he suggested, testing her reaction. "We can continue the celebration at home." "No!" The answer came out louder than she intended, drawing curious glances from neighboring tables. Isabella quickly composed herself, forcing a smile. "I mean, it's still early. Let's enjoy it a little longer." But Edward could see she was fighting something. Her hands were trembling more visibly now, and she seemed to have difficulty focusing her gaze. Small beads of sweat appeared on her forehead, despite the pleasant temperature of the room. Her phone vibrated on the table, and Edward managed to see part of the message before she quickly snatched it. The words "not yet" and "wait" were visible on the screen, sent by a contact saved only as M. "No work," she explained, hurriedly putting the phone away. "You know how clients are, always urgent." But Edward no longer believed her explanations. With each passing minute, the terrible possibility that a 6-year-old child had saved his life became more real. And if that were true, it meant the woman he had loved for 2 years had planned something unimaginable against him. An hour had passed since dessert, when Isabella began to show more worrying signs. Her hands trembled visibly as she tried to pick up her water glass, and Edward had to lean forward to hear her words, which came out increasingly low and slurred. "Edward," she murmured, her eyes struggling to maintain focus. "I don't think I'm feeling very well." His heart pounded, a complex mix of panic and confirmation taking over his feelings. On one hand, seeing the woman he loved suffer distressed him. On the other, the terrible reality that she had tried to do the same to him created a whirlwind of emotions he could barely process. "Let's get out of here," Edward said, discreetly signaling the waiter. "You need some fresh air." But before he could stand up, Isabella grabbed his arm with surprising strength for someone in her condition. "No," she whispered urgently. "We can't go yet. I need to stay here." Her insistence on remaining in the restaurant, even while feeling unwell, confirmed Edward's darkest suspicions. She was waiting for something or someone. Perhaps she was waiting for the effects to manifest in him. Or perhaps there was a larger plan underway. Isabella's phone vibrated again, and this time Edward managed to see the full message before she could hide it. "Where's the result?" It should have happened by now. It was from the same contact, M, who had sent the previous message. "Isabella," Edward said, his voice filled with an authority she had never heard before. "Who is M?" She looked at him with glazed eyes, struggling to process the question. "I don't know what you're talking about," she murmured, but her attempt to lie was pathetic in her weakened state. Edward took her phone before she could react, scrolling through recent messages. What he found chilled his blood. Detailed conversations about the plan, references to substance in the cake, and most shockingly, discussions about his fortune and how it would be divided after his accidental death. "My God," Edward murmured, the pieces finally fitting together into a terrifying picture. "How long have you been planning this?" Isabella tried to deny it, but her protests came out incoherently. The effects of the substance in her system made it impossible to maintain any facade. Tears began to stream down her face, a mixture of fear, regret, and desperation at being discovered. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whimpered. "You weren't supposed to." "How did you know?" "A 6-year-old girl had more courage and honesty than the woman I loved," Edward replied, his voice trembling with restrained emotion. "A child you probably wouldn't even consider human saved my life." The restaurant around them continued its nightly energy, completely oblivious to the personal drama unfolding at the corner table. Edward realized he needed to act quickly. Isabella was clearly in medical danger, and regardless of what she had tried to do, he couldn't just let her die. "I'm calling an ambulance," he said, picking up his own phone. "No," Isabella managed to gather her strength to protest. "You can't. They'll find out. I'll go to jail." "You should have thought of that before you tried to poison me," Edward replied coldly, but dialed 911 nonetheless. While speaking to the dispatcher, explaining that his companion had suddenly fallen ill, Edward watched Isabella deteriorate. Her skin was pale and sweaty, her breathing irregular, and she seemed to have difficulty maintaining consciousness. The maitre d' approached the table, clearly concerned about the situation. "Is there a problem, Mr. Miller?" he asked, but Edward noticed nervousness in his voice. "Can we help in any way?" Edward studied the man's face, noticing signs of anxiety that went beyond normal professional concern. "You're part of this too, aren't you?" he asked directly. The maitre d' paled, confirming Edward's suspicions. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir," he stammered, but his nervous eyes betrayed him. "How many people are involved in this conspiracy?" Edward stood up, his imposing height intimidating the smaller man. "How many employees of this restaurant knew my girlfriend was trying to kill me?" The murmur from nearby tables subsided as other customers began to realize something was wrong. Whispers spread through the room, and Edward realized he would soon have an audience for the unfolding drama. Isabella moaned softly, her head lolling forward as she fought unconsciousness. Edward felt a pang of pain in his chest, seeing her like this, not for the woman who had tried to kill him, but for the image of the person he thought she was. In the back of his mind, a single image reassured him. The large, brave eyes of a girl who had risked everything to save a stranger. In a world full of betrayal and greed, at least there was still pure innocence and kindness. The sound of the ambulance siren echoed through the busy streets before stopping in front of the Gilded Lily. Edward watched through the restaurant windows as paramedics disembarked from the vehicle with medical equipment, preparing for what they believed was just another routine medical emergency. They had no idea they were about to get involved in a thwarted murder attempt. Isabella had lost consciousness completely, her limp body in the chair supported only by the upholstered backrest. Edward felt a complex mix of emotions observing her in that state: anger at the betrayal, sadness for the lost love, and a basic human concern he couldn't completely suppress. The paramedics entered the restaurant with professional efficiency, carrying a foldable stretcher and a medical bag. The elegant ambiance of the Gilded Lily contrasted bizarrely with the unfolding medical emergency, creating a surreal scene that captured the attention of all present customers. "What happened?" asked the lead paramedic, a middle-aged man with experienced eyes that had seen it all. He knelt beside Isabella, checking her vital signs with quick, precise movements. "She suddenly felt unwell," Edward explained, technically telling the truth. "It started with a headache and dizziness, then rapidly worsened." The paramedic frowned as he examined Isabella. "Low blood pressure, dilated pupils, irregular breathing," he muttered to his partner. "Looks like poisoning. Did you consume alcohol or any substances?" Edward hesitated for a moment, realizing he was on the threshold of a decision that would change everything. He could simply say he knew nothing, let the doctors figure it out on their own. Or he could tell the truth and face the consequences of an accusation no one would believe. "We ate the same meal," he finally said, "but I feel fine." As the paramedics prepared Isabella for transport, Edward noticed suspicious movement in his peripheral vision. The maitre d' was talking rapidly with two men in suits he hadn't seen before. They gestured nervously towards the table where everything had happened, clearly concerned about the turn of events. One of the men took out his phone and made a quick call, speaking in low but urgent tones. Edward managed to catch a few words. Problem. Plan failed. Damage control. Lee. It was obvious the conspiracy went far beyond Isabella and a few restaurant employees. "Sir, will you accompany the patient to the hospital?" the paramedic asked, interrupting Edward's observations. "Of course," he replied, but his eyes remained fixed on the suspicious men. "She's my girlfriend." As the stretcher was prepared, Edward discreetly photographed the men with his cell phone, trying to document faces that might be important later. He noticed one of them was watching him too, and their eyes met for a tense moment. The transport to the ambulance was quick, but Edward felt each second stretch as he processed the magnitude of what he had discovered. It wasn't just a greedy girlfriend trying to inherit his fortune. There was an organized network behind the assassination attempt, people who had invested time and resources in the plan. At the hospital, Edward watched the doctors take Isabella to the emergency room while a nurse led him to a waiting area. The sterile environment and typical hospital sounds created a surreal atmosphere after the elegance of the restaurant where it all began. "Mr. Miller?" A voice behind him made him turn. Two NYPD detectives stood in the doorway, their serious faces suggesting this wasn't a courtesy visit. "That's me," Edward replied, feeling his stomach clench. "Detective Thompson and Detective Rodriguez," they introduced themselves, showing their badges. "We need to talk to you about tonight's events. The hospital is required to report suspected cases of poisoning." Edward realized the moment of truth had arrived. He had evidence of the conspiracy on Isabella's phone, but he also knew his story would sound completely absurd. A millionaire, saved by a 6-year-old homeless girl who managed to uncover a murder plot. Who would believe that? "Of course, detectives," he said, mentally preparing for the most important conversation of his life. "But before we begin, I need you to know that I am also a victim in this situation." The detectives exchanged skeptical glances, and Edward realized his battle for the truth was just beginning. Outside, somewhere in the city, a brave girl had disappeared after saving his life, and powerful people were determined to ensure she could never tell her side of the story. The turning point had come, and Edward knew nothing in his life would be the same from that moment on. The hospital interrogation room was small and dimly lit, with white walls that seemed to close in on Edward as the two detectives positioned themselves strategically. Detective Thompson, a burly man with a graying mustache, maintained an impassive expression, while Detective Rodriguez, younger and thinner, scribbled notes in a pad with nervous movements. "Let's start with the basics," Thompson said, his deep voice echoing in the confined space. "You and Ms. Isabella Monroe were celebrating what exactly at the restaurant tonight?" Edward took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. "It was our 2-year anniversary. I had planned a special night." He hesitated, realizing the bitter irony of his words. "Very special. And during this celebration, Ms. Monroe consumed something that left her in critical condition," Rodriguez continued, looking up from his pad. "Do you have any idea what could have caused this reaction?" Edward knew the crucial moment had arrived. Telling the truth meant sounding like a lunatic, but lying could destroy his chances of proving his innocence later. "Detectives, I know what I'm about to tell you will seem impossible to believe, but I have evidence." Thompson leaned forward, his experienced eyes studying every nuance of Edward's expression. "We're listening." "Isabella tried to poison me," Edward said, his words falling like stones in the silence of the room. "She put something in the cake that was meant for me. By chance, I discreetly swapped the plates, and she ended up consuming her own trap." The two detectives exchanged skeptical looks. Rodriguez stopped writing and stared at Edward as if he had just confessed to being an alien. "Mr. Miller, that's..." A very serious accusation. What evidence do you have to support this claim? Edward took Isabella's phone, which was still in his pocket. Her messages, detailed conversations about the plan, references to the substance in the cake, discussions about my fortune. He handed the device to the detectives. It's all here. Thompson took the phone and began to navigate the messages, his eyebrows furrowing. As he read, Rodriguez looked over his colleague's shoulder, his expression gradually changing from skepticism to surprise. These messages are disturbing, Thompson admitted after a few minutes. But how did you know you should swap the plates? Why were you suspicious? Edward swallowed hard, knowing this part would be the hardest to explain. A girl warned me, a homeless child who frequents the area around the restaurant. She told me not to eat the cake, that Isabella had put something in it. The silence that followed was deafening. Rodriguez resumed writing furiously while Thompson leaned back in his chair with an expression that mixed disbelief and professional concern. A homeless child, Thompson repeated slowly. And you believed her. Why? Because there was something in her eyes, Edward explained, knowing how desperate it sounded. An urgency, a genuine fear. She risked her safety to warn me. Where is this girl now? Rodriguez asked, his pen suspended over the paper. Edward felt a tightness in his chest. I don't know. She disappeared after giving me the warning. I tried to find her in the restaurant, but she was gone. Thompson stood up and began to pace the small room, clearly processing contradictory information. Mr. Miller, let's be honest here. Your story is unusual, to say the least. A rich man saved by a homeless girl, a conspiratorial girlfriend who accidentally poisons herself. Do you understand why we might have doubts? I understand completely, Edward replied, keeping his voice firm. But examine her phone, look at the restaurant's security cameras, investigate the staff who were working tonight. There's a larger conspiracy here. Rodriguez flipped through his notes. You mentioned evidence from the cameras. What exactly should we be looking for? Isabella knew the restaurant too well. The staff treated her with excessive familiarity. There were suspicious men talking to the maitre d' after the incident. Edward leaned forward, trying to convey urgency. And more importantly, the cameras should show the girl running to my table to warn me. Thompson stopped pacing and looked directly at Edward. Assuming your story is true, it raises an even more disturbing question. Why would anyone want to kill you? Do you have enemies? Edward shook his head. I've always been discreet with my fortune. I try to help people in need, but I keep my personal life private. I can't imagine who would benefit from my death, other than Isabella herself. Unless, Rodriguez murmured, looking at Thompson, she wasn't the mastermind. The implication of Rodriguez's words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. What if Isabella was just a pawn in a larger game? What if someone more powerful was behind the assassination attempt? We need more information, Thompson decided. We'll request the restaurant's security footage and start investigating the staff. Mr. Miller, you cannot leave the city until we clarify this situation. Edward agreed, but his mind was already working in another direction. He needed to find the girl before the real culprits found her. If she had indeed seen Isabella preparing the poison, her life was in extreme danger. And if anything happened, to the only witness who could prove his innocence, Edward knew he would be considered guilty of a crime that had been planned against him. Dawn arrived with a storm of flashes and microphones pointed at Edward as he left the hospital. During the few hours he had spent answering questions at the precinct, the story had leaked to the press with astonishing speed. Millionaire investigated. After girlfriend falls ill in luxury restaurant, blared the headlines of every news portal. Edward descended the hospital steps, trying to ignore the shouted questions from reporters. Is it true you poisoned your girlfriend? Were there problems in the relationship? Was the fortune the motive? Each question was like a stab to his reputation, built over decades of honest work and charitable actions. His private driver, Carl, managed to clear a path to the armored car through the crowd of journalists. "Sir, this is getting very ugly," he murmured as he sped away from the chaos. "The phones won't stop ringing. Your secretary is desperately trying to control the situation." Edward closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the injustice crashing down on him. But in the back of his mind, an image persisted, the large, brave eyes of the girl who had risked everything to save him. She was the key to proving his innocence, and he needed to find her before it was too late. "Carl, I need you to take me downtown," Edward instructed. "We're going to search every place where homeless children usually take shelter." "Sir, with all due respect, don't you think you should stay home until this blows over? The press is after you like vultures." Edward shook his head with determination. "Every hour that passes is another hour for the real culprits to erase evidence or silence the only witness who can save me." They started in the downtown area, combing underpasses, abandoned building awnings, and squares where groups of homeless people gathered. Edward got out of the car at each location, ignoring the curious and sometimes hostile stares his presence provoked. His elegant attire and luxury car clearly marked him as an outsider in that world. "I'm looking for a girl," he explained to each group he encountered. "About 6 years old, dark hair, very smart. She frequents the area around the Gilded Lily restaurant." Responses ranged from indifference to suspicion. Some homeless people recognized him from the news and made sarcastic comments about the millionaire murderer looking for his next victim. Others simply ignored his questions, accustomed to being invisible to people, like him. After 3 hours of fruitless searching, Edward stopped at a square where a group of women were preparing a community breakfast. The group's leader, an elderly woman with white hair and kind eyes, watched him curiously as he approached. "The girl you're looking for," she said without preamble, "is in danger." Edward felt his heart race. "You know her? Do you know where she is?" The woman, who introduced herself as Mama Rose, motioned for him to sit on a nearby bench. "That child showed up here last night, terrified, said bad people were after her, that she'd seen something she shouldn't have." "Where is she now?" Edward asked urgently. "She ran off during the night," Mama Rose replied, her expression worried. "2 men in suits showed up here asking for her. Said they were social workers, but social workers don't drive black SUVs or ask threatening questions." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. The conspiracy was even larger than he had imagined, and now powerful people were actively hunting the only witness who could save him. "Do you have any idea where she might have gone?" Edward insisted. Mama Rose hesitated, studying his face. "Carefully. Why should I trust you? The papers say you tried to kill your girlfriend." Edward took a deep breath, realizing he needed to be completely honest. "Because that girl saved my life. My girlfriend tried to poison me, and that brave child warned me. Now she's in danger for helping me, and I can't let anything happen to her." The sincerity in his voice must have convinced Mama Rose, because she nodded slowly. "There's an old church in Chinatown. Father Michael usually shelters at-risk children. If she sought help, she might have gone there." Edward thanked her profusely and hurried back to the car. As Carl drove towards the church, his phone rang constantly with calls from journalists, lawyers, and acquaintances, wanting his side of the story. He ignored them all, focusing only on finding the girl before it was too late. St. Francis Church was an old, modest building, contrasting with the modern skyscrapers that surrounded it. Edward climbed the stone steps with a racing heart, knowing this could be his last chance to find the truth. Father Michael, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, received him at the door with a cautious expression. "Mr. Miller, I saw your face on the news. What brings you here?" I'm looking for a girl who might be in great danger, Edward explained quickly. She saved me from an assassination attempt, and now the real culprits are trying to silence her. The priest studied his face for a long moment before nodding. Come in. There's someone here who needs to speak with you. The interior of the church was bathed in a comforting dimness, illuminated only by the colored light filtering through the ancient stained glass windows. Edward followed Father Michael through narrow corridors, passing small rooms where volunteers organized donations of clothes and food. The smell of candle wax and incense created an atmosphere of peace that contrasted sharply with the chaos his life had become. She arrived here last night, the priest explained in a low voice as they walked. She was terrified, talking about dangerous men chasing her. Sister Teresa managed to calm her down a bit, but she insists she needs to talk to you. Edward felt a mixture of relief and concern. Finding the girl was his priority, but knowing she was in danger for trying to help him created an enormous weight on his conscience. Is she safe here? For now, the priest replied gravely, but those men looking for her didn't seem willing to give up easily. We had to be very careful. They stopped before a wooden door painted light blue. Father Michael knocked gently 3 times, apparently a prearranged code, before opening the door. Edward entered the small room and immediately recognized the frail figure huddled in a chair in the corner. The girl looked up as he entered, and Edward saw the same piercing gaze that had impressed him the night before. But now there was fear in those eyes, a vulnerability that broke his heart. She wore clean clothes provided by the church, a simple dress and shoes that were too big for her small feet. You came, she murmured, her voice barely audible. I thought you wouldn't believe me. Edward knelt in front of her, bringing himself to the child's level. I believed you, little one. You saved my life. His voice trembled with emotion. How did you know? How did you find out what Isabella was planning? The girl looked nervously at the priest, who nodded encouragingly. You can tell him, Maya. Mr. Miller is here to help. Maya, Edward finally knew her name, took a deep breath before starting. I was looking for food in the dumpsters behind the restaurant when I heard voices in the kitchen. The window was open because of the heat. She paused, her small hands trembling slightly. Edward waited patiently, realizing that reliving those moments was difficult for her. The pretty lady was there with a man in a suit. They were messing with a cake, putting something in it. The man said it had to be perfect, that it couldn't go wrong this time. Edward felt his blood run cold. This time? Did they mention other attempts? Maya nodded, her large eyes fixed on his face. The man said the other times were too suspicious, that this time it had to look like an accident. The lady laughed and said you'd never suspect her. The girl's words confirmed Edward's worst fears. It hadn't been an impulsive plan. Isabella had tried to kill him before, and only his luck or natural caution had protected him. Did you get a look at the man's face? Edward asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Yes, Maya brightened a little, and I recorded them talking too. Edward and Father Michael exchanged surprised looks. You recorded them? Edward repeated, hardly believing what he heard. Maya pulled an old, cracked cell phone from her pocket. I found this phone in the trash last week. It still works a little. When I heard them talking about hurting you, I decided to record it. With small but determined fingers, she fiddled with the device until she found the audio file. The sound was muffled and full of static, but it was possible to clearly hear the voices of Isabella and a man discussing details of the poisoning. Are you sure the dose will be sufficient this time? Isabella's voice could be heard. You can trust me, darling. It's an almost undetectable substance. It'll look like a natural heart attack, and then all that fortune will be ours. Edward closed his eyes, feeling nauseous as he heard the coldness in the voice of the woman he had loved. But at the same time, he felt immense gratitude for that brave child who had risked everything to save him. "Maya," he said softly, "you're the bravest person I've ever met. But now we need to keep you safe while the police use this recording to arrest the real culprits." The girl surprised him by taking his hand. "Mister, they talked about a list. The names. You're not the first one they tried to hurt." The revelation hit Edward like a lightning bolt. If there were other targets, the conspiracy was even larger than he had imagined. How many people had already been victims? How many others were in danger? "Sister Teresa," Father Michael called, and a middle-aged nun entered the room. "We need to contact the police immediately, and we'll need special protection for Maya." Edward looked at the girl who had changed his life in minutes with her extraordinary courage. "Maya, I promise I'll take care of you. You'll never have to worry about food or shelter or bad people again." For the first time since he'd met her, Maya smiled, a shy but genuine smile that lit up her whole face. "You really promise?" "I promise," Edward replied, feeling like he was making the most important promise of his life. "And we'll make sure those people never hurt anyone again." The priest's phone rang, interrupting the moment. His expression changed to concern after answering. "There are men outside the church," he informed them gravely. "It seems they've found us." Father Michael moved with surprising agility for his age, quickly closing the curtains of the small room and gesturing for everyone to remain silent. Edward picked Maya up, feeling how light and fragile she was, her little heart beating rapidly against his chest. The recording on the old cell phone could be the key to exposing the entire conspiracy, but only if they could get out of there alive. "There's a passage at the back of the church," the priest whispered, moving an old cabinet that revealed a narrow door. "It was built during the Prohibition era to protect people. It leads to the parish house on the other side of the block." Edward followed the priest down the narrow, dimly lit corridor with Maya clinging to his neck. Behind them, Sister Teresa quickly erased any evidence that they had been in the room. The sound of men's voices echoed through the main church, suggesting the men had already entered the building. "Do they know the girl around here?" they heard a harsh voice ask. "They said she might have sought shelter here," another voice replied. "Search every corner. She couldn't have gone far." Maya trembled in Edward's arms, burying her face in his shoulder. He whispered reassuring words in her ear, promising that everything would be all right, even though he wasn't entirely sure himself. The responsibility of protecting that brave child weighed on him more than any business deal he had ever conducted. The tunnel opened into a damp basement filled with boxes and old church equipment. Father Michael lit a small flashlight, illuminating a wooden staircase leading to the upper floor. Every step they took creaked softly, creating small sounds that seemed to echo like thunder in the tense silence. "My car is parked behind the parish house," the priest murmured as they ascended. "But we need to be very careful. These men may have surrounded the entire block." Edward quickly thought about the available options. His own safety was important, but the absolute priority was ensuring Maya and the recording reached the police safely. Without that evidence, he would remain the prime suspect, and the real conspiracy would remain hidden. "Father, do you know a reliable detective?" Edward asked as they reached the upper floor of the parish house. "Someone who can't be bought or intimidated." "Detective Miller from the downtown precinct," the priest replied without hesitation. "He's worked with me on several child protection cases. He's a man of integrity." They reached a window overlooking the back of the property. Edward carefully peeked through the curtains and saw two men in suits patrolling the area. They were the same faces he had photographed at the restaurant the night before. The confirmation that they were being actively pursued made his blood run cold. "There are a lot of them out there," he informed the priest. "We need a distraction." Maya stirred in his arms and whispered, "Mister, I know a way across the rooftops. The street kids use it to escape when the cops come to clear us from the squares." Edward looked at her with admiration and concern. "It's very dangerous, Maya." "You're too small, but I know how to do it," she insisted with a determination that was impressive in someone so young. "And they won't expect us to escape from above." Father Michael carefully opened a window that gave access to the roof. "The neighboring church is only 3 blocks away. If you can get there, I can call their pastor and ask him to call the police." Edward hesitated for a moment, weighing the risks. Staying there meant eventually being found by the men patrolling the area. Trying to escape over the rooftops was dangerous, especially with a child, but it might be their only chance. "Let's try it," he decided, holding Maya firmly. "But you'll guide me, little heroine." The escape over the rooftops was a terrifying and surreal experience. Maya, despite her small size, moved with the agility of someone accustomed to that precarious environment. Edward followed her as silently as possible, trying not to look down as they crossed from one building to another via makeshift bridges of planks and pipes. During the crossing, Edward couldn't help but admire the extraordinary courage of the girl guiding him. How many nights had she had to use those dangerous paths just to survive? Life on the streets had forged in her a strength and wisdom that many adults would never develop. "There," Maya whispered, pointing to a church steeple rising a few rooftops ahead. "It's safe to go down there." As they approached their destination, Edward heard the sound of police sirens in the distance. His steps became more urgent. Whatever the reason for the sirens, he needed to deliver the recording to the authorities before the conspirators could find a way to destroy the evidence or silence Maya permanently. The life of the brave girl, who had saved him now, depended on his ability to protect her, and Edward was determined not to fail in this mission, even if it cost him everything he owned. The descent from the church tower was tense but successful, with Maya guiding Edward through narrow internal staircases until they reached the ground floor. The local pastor, an elderly man named Father Matthew, received them with surprise but quickly understood the gravity of the situation when Father Michael called, explaining everything. "The police are on their way," Father Matthew informed them, hanging up the phone. "Detective Miller said he'll come personally, but there's something else you need to know." "Bis," Edward felt a knot in his stomach. "What happened?" "Isabella Monroe died at the hospital an hour ago," the priest said gravely. "The substance was more toxic than the doctors could neutralize." The silence that followed was heavy and complex. Edward felt a mixture of sadness for the woman he had loved and relief, knowing she could no longer hurt him or others. Maya watched him with her big eyes, seeming to intuitively understand the emotional conflict he was facing. "Mister," she said softly, "it wasn't your fault. She chose to do bad things." The girl's simple wisdom touched him deeply. Even having lived so little, she understood truths about responsibility and consequences that many adults struggled to accept. The sound of approaching cars put them on alert, but Edward relaxed when he recognized the police cruisers parking in front of the church. Through the window, he saw Detective Miller, a man of medium height with graying hair and a determined expression, stepping out of the first vehicle. "Mr. Miller," the detective greeted as he entered the church, "this is a very complicated situation. I need to hear your version of events and examine the evidence you claim to have." Edward handed over Maya's cell phone, explaining how she had recorded the conversation between Isabella and the mysterious man. The detective listened intently to the recording, his eyebrows furrowing as he understood the magnitude of the conspiracy. "This is crucial evidence," Miller admitted. "But I need your full cooperation to dismantle this organization. The girl mentioned a list with other names." Maya nodded shyly and whispered something in Edward's ear. He translated for the detective. She says she heard them mention at least 5 names, all wealthy men in the city. Apparently there's a pattern. All are single or widowers without direct heirs. The revelation made the detective's eyes widen. We're talking about a serial murder operation planned to steal inheritances. This is much bigger than we imagined. Over the next hour, Edward provided all the details he could remember about Isabella's suspicious behavior, her connections to the restaurant, and the mysterious men he had seen. Maya, initially shy, gradually opened up with the detective's patience, providing detailed descriptions of the conspirators. "There's something else," Maya said suddenly, surprising everyone. "The man talked about an office downtown. He said he had the papers of other rich people there." Detective Miller immediately coordinated an operation to locate and apprehend the remaining members of the conspiracy. Within hours, 3 men were arrested, including the mysterious M, who had been sending messages to Isabella. The office Maya mentioned revealed detailed files on 10 wealthy men in the city, including Edward. "You saved many lives today," the detective told Edward and Maya when the last suspects were arrested. "This organization had been operating for at least 2 years. We've identified 3 suspicious deaths that will now be re-examined." Edward felt a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that his innocence had been proven, but horror at discovering how many people had been victims of unbridled greed. He looked at Maya, who remained quiet by his side, still processing everything that had happened. "Maya," he said, kneeling in front of her, "you didn't just save my life. You saved the lives of many people you don't even know. You're a true heroine." The girl blushed, unaccustomed to praise or recognition. "I just did what was right," she murmured. "And that's exactly why you're special," Edward replied, tears forming in his eyes. Detective Miller approached them. "Mr. Miller, your legal situation is completely cleared, but there's a question about the girl's custody. She has no known family, and technically she should go to a state shelter." Edward felt his heart pound. The idea of Maya returning to life on the streets or being placed in a system that might not adequately protect her was unacceptable. "Detective," he said with determination, "I'd like to immediately begin the adoption process. Maya saved my life, and now I want to save hers too." Maya's eyes widened with surprise and hope. "You really want me to be your daughter?" "More than anything in the world," Edward replied, hugging her tenderly. "If you want to, of course." The smile that lit up Maya's face was the most beautiful answer Edward had ever received in his entire life. A month passed since the night that forever changed Edward's and Maya's lives. The adoption process proved more complex than Edward had anticipated, but his determination and resources significantly facilitated the legal procedures. Maya had undergone complete medical exams, revealing malnutrition and some health issues, stemming from life on the streets, but nothing that proper care couldn't resolve. The media coverage of the story had taken a completely different turn. "Hero Girl Saves Millionaire and Exposes Criminal Network" was now the headline dominating the newspapers. Edward, initially reluctant about the exposure, realized the story could inspire others to pay attention to the invisible children living on the margins of society. "How are you feeling about school?" Edward asked, as they had breakfast on the terrace of his house, which had now been adapted to welcome his new daughter. Maya wore a new school uniform, her clean, well-cared-for hair shining in the morning sun. "A little nervous," Maya admitted, stirring her cereal with a spoon. "I've never been to school before. What if the other kids don't like me?" Edward sat beside her, his comforting presence lessening the girl's anxiety. "You're one of the smartest and bravest people I know. The other kids will be lucky to know you." During the weeks of adjustment, Edward had discovered fascinating layers of Maya's personality. She had an exceptional memory, an insatiable curiosity about everything around her, and a natural empathy that constantly impressed him. Life on the streets had developed in her observational skills and intuition that many people would never develop. "Dad," Maya said, the words still sounding sweet and surreal to Edward's ears, "do you think Miss Isabella was very sad to do those bad things?" The question demonstrated the girl's emotional depth and her attempt to understand human complexity. Edward chose his words carefully. "I think some people get so lost in greed that they forget what really matters in life," he replied. "Isabella made terrible choices, but you taught me that we can always choose to do good." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "Like the other men on the list, are they still sad because they lost people they loved?" Edward had become the point of contact for the other potential victims of the criminal conspiracy. 3 of the men on the list had lost wives in circumstances now considered suspicious, and Edward was helping to fund re-investigations of the cases. It was a way to honor Maya's courage and ensure no injustice remained hidden. "I'm helping them find out the truth," Edward explained, "and you inspired me to do that." Adjusting to domestic life hadn't been easy for Maya. Accustomed to the freedom of the streets and the constant need to be alert, she initially had difficulty relaxing in the safety of her new home. Occasional nightmares made her wake up during the night, and Edward always rushed to her room to console her. "I dreamed the bad men came back," she would murmur on one of those nights, clinging to Edward as if he were her only anchor in the storm. "You're safe now," Edward would reassure her, sitting on the edge of her bed until she fell back asleep. "I promise I'll never let anything bad happen to you." The justice system had worked with unusual efficiency in the case. The 3 arrested conspirators were facing charges of murder, attempted murder, and racketeering. The evidence collected was so compelling that their lawyers were negotiating guilty pleas in exchange for reduced sentences. Edward had also implemented significant changes in his own life. He hired a private investigator to do a complete sweep of his personal security, revised his wills and legal documents, and established a charitable foundation specifically dedicated to helping homeless children. "I want you to know," he told Maya as he drove her to her first day of school, "that you didn't just save my life. You taught me what really matters." Maya looked at him through the car's rearview mirror. "What matters, Dad?" "Family," Edward replied without hesitation, "taking care of the people we love and protecting those who need help." When they arrived at the school, a private institution Edward had carefully chosen for its reputation of welcoming children from different backgrounds, Maya hesitated at the door. "What if I can't learn the things the other kids already know?" she asked, her small voice revealing the insecurity she still carried. Edward knelt in front of her, holding her small hands. "Maya, you've already learned to survive alone on this streets, to be brave when adults were scared, and to do the right thing even when it was dangerous. Learning math and English will be a piece of cake for you." The smile she gave him was radiant and confident. "You're right. I'm strong." "The strongest I know," Edward confirmed, kissing her forehead. "And when you come home today, I want to hear all about your first day." As he watched Maya bravely enter the school, Edward reflected on how his life had completely changed. A month ago, he was a wealthy but essentially solitary man. Now, he had a daughter who taught him daily about courage, compassion, and the importance of valuing every shared moment. The transformation wasn't just external. Edward felt he had discovered a deeper purpose for his life, a responsibility that went far beyond accumulating wealth. He had a little heroine to raise, protect, and love. 6 months after the night that changed their lives forever, Edward and Maya walked hand in hand through the bustling city streets towards the Gilded Lily. The restaurant had become a special symbol for them, Not just the place where a tragedy almost happened, but where two lonely souls found a family in each other. Maya, now a newly turned 7-year-old, had grown visibly during those months. Her hair shone with health, her eyes maintained the same wisdom as always, but now also carried the security of someone who knows she is unconditionally loved. The school uniform had given way to a floral dress and new shoes she had chosen especially for the occasion. "Dad, do you think they'll remember us?" Maya asked, squeezing Edward's hand as they approached the familiar entrance of the restaurant. "I'm sure they will," Edward replied, smiling at the thought of the reaction they would cause. "Our story has become quite famous around here." The maitre d' who greeted them was not the same one from the fateful night. That man was now serving time for his role in the conspiracy. The new manager, a young man named Robert, recognized them immediately and greeted them with genuine respect. "Mr. Miller, Miss Maya," he said with a warm smile, "it's an honor to welcome you back. Your special table is prepared." They were led to the same table where everything had happened, but now the atmosphere carried a completely different energy. The decor remained elegant, but Edward no longer felt the tension that had marked his last visit. Instead, there was peace, gratitude, and the simple joy of sharing a special moment with his daughter. "This table looks different now," Maya observed, looking around curiously. "Happier?" Edward agreed, admiring how his daughter could perceive emotional nuances that many adults would ignore. "It's because now we're here as a real family." During dinner, they talked about the months that had passed. Maya told him about her friends at school, especially Julia, a shy girl she had helped adjust after her family moved from another state. Edward smiled, realizing how his daughter naturally protected the more vulnerable, a trait that had made her special from the first moment. "The teacher said I'm the best math student in class," Maya said with modest pride. "And I'm also helping the younger kids read better." "Doesn't surprise me one bit," Edward replied. "You've always been special at seeing what others need." Edward also shared news about his work. The experience had motivated him to redirect a significant portion of his business towards social projects. He'd established a support program for homeless children, funded 3 new shelters in the city, and was working with the government to improve child protection policies. "Do you know why I'm doing all this?" he asked Maya. "Because you have a good heart," she replied, tilting her head curiously. "Because you taught me that true wealth lies in caring for one another," Edward explained. "You showed me that a 6-year-old girl can have more courage and wisdom than any adult." When it was time for dessert, the waiter brought a chocolate cake, specially prepared for them. It was similar to the one that had caused so much drama months before, but now it represented celebration and renewal. Maya laughed when she saw the elaborate decoration. "This time I know it's safe," she joked, making Edward laugh too. "This time we know we're safe with each other," he corrected, cutting 2 generous slices. As they ate, Edward reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them there. A year earlier, he was a successful but essentially lonely man, focused on accumulating wealth without truly understanding its purpose. The assassination attempt had been traumatic, but it had also been the catalyst for discovering what really mattered in life. "Dad," Maya said suddenly, looking out the window at the busy street, "do you see that girl over there?" Edward followed her gaze and saw a child of perhaps 8 years old begging on the sidewalk in front of the restaurant. His heart ached as he recognized the familiar vulnerability. "Do you want to go talk to her?" Edward asked, already knowing the answer. Maya nodded enthusiastically. They paid the bill and left the restaurant, approaching the girl gently. Maya knelt in front of her, speaking in soft tones about safe shelters and people who could help. Edward watched with pride as his daughter demonstrated the same compassion that had saved his own life. 2 hours later, they had taken the girl, whose name was Anna, to one of the shelters Edward funded. Seeing Maya share her own experience of transformation with another child in need was one of the most moving moments of Edward's life. "This is how we change the world," Maya said as they drove home. "One person at a time." Edward smiled, realizing his 7-year-old daughter had just articulated a philosophy of life more profound than many self-help books. "You're right, my little wise one." That night, as he tucked Maya into bed, Edward reflected on how two broken lives had found and rebuilt each other. He had gained an extraordinary daughter, and she had gained a family and opportunities that would transform her future. "Dad," Maya murmured as he covered her, "thank you for choosing me." "Thank you for saving me," Edward replied, kissing her forehead. "In every possible way." As Maya fell asleep, Edward remained there for a few moments, observing the serene face of the child who had changed his life. Outside, the city continued its frenetic pace, full of people chasing their own dreams and facing their own challenges. But there, in that quiet room, was a small family built on the most solid foundation possible: unconditional love, courage in the face of adversity, and the unwavering belief that it is always worth doing the right thing. The story that had begun with an attempt at destruction had transformed into a narrative of renewal, hope, and the transformative power of a pure heart. Edward knew that regardless of the challenges the future held, he and Maya would face them together, protecting each other and extending that protection to all who needed it. Edward's true fortune was no longer in his bank accounts, but in his daughter's sleeping smile and the certainty that they had found in each other the greatest treasure possible: a true family.